begin in just a moment, so please take your seats and be sure all electronic devices have been silenced. Once again, our program will begin in just a moment, so please take your seats. Once again, our program will begin in just a moment, so please take your seats. seats. The program is about to begin.
Good morning, everyone. Please welcome back your ISEF host, Barb Baker.
Good morning, everyone. You guys look great this morning. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Excellence in Science and Technology panel presented by Society for Science. We'll be hearing from several notable guests during this virtual panel, each of whom is joining us today because they share a passion for nurturing the next generation of young scientists and engineers. And for those of you presenting your questions to the panel today, please step to the microphone in the center aisle when prompted. We'll begin with this message from Society for Science.
The Society for Science champions science through award-winning journalism, world-class science competitions, and advocating for a more diverse STEM landscape. Our story began in 1921, when publishing magnate Edward W. Scripps and zoologist William Ritter founded Science Service and published the first Science News Bulletin. Our journalistic debut was a collection of science news stories, aiming to foster and advance the public understanding of science. Today, the magazine Science News reaches millions of readers every day. Part of the founders' vision included science competitions. In 1950, the Society held the first National Science Fair in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 30 young scientists competed for acclaim and prizes totaling $1,000 in scientific equipment. This fair was just the beginning of what would grow to become the largest science and engineering competition in the world, with affiliated fairs in 80 countries, regions, and territories. This year, close to 2,000 finalists are competing for nearly $8 million in awards and scholarships. But ISEF is much more than a science competition. Our goal is to form a community, to encourage young people to solve the world's most intractable problems through STEM. The Excellence in Science and Technology panel enables all of us to hear directly from Nobel laureates and other esteemed members of the scientific community, allowing the greatest minds in science to answer the questions of the future.
Thanks to the Society for sponsoring this program. Now, please welcome our moderator, National Public Radio's science correspondent, Joe Palca. Good morning, Joe.
Hi there, everyone.
Thanks for being with us today.
Yes. Oh, thanks, Barb. It's great to be here. The only sad part is that I'm not actually there. But, I think there's this COVID thing that's causing some people travel issues. I'm not sure. Yeah, we're going to have a great panel. I've been doing this for a long time, and each year it's different and fun and engaging. We asked all of the finalists to submit questions, and of course we got many questions submitted. The few that we were able to choose in the time we have, we'll just run through those, and apologies to those who weren't called on. But let's get started. I'd first like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Elizabeth Blackburn, the Morris Hertzstein Professor of Biology and Physiology, Biochemistry and Physics, University of California, San Francisco, and 2009 Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology. Hi. Next, we have Marty Chalfie, PhD, Professor of Chemistry, Columbia University, 2008 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And then Francis Collins, PhD and MD, former director of the National Human Genome Research Institute and leader of many bands. Sorry.
Hello.
And finally, Roderick Pettigrew, PhD and MD. He was in ISEF at 1967. He's a professor of biomedical engineering. He's the dean and intercollegiate school of engineering and medicine. He's the chief executive officer of the Engineering Health Robert A. Welch Chair in Chemistry at Texas A&M University and the 2020 Vannevar Bush Award recipient. So, you can find a better group of people to answer thoughtful questions about science. You tell me who they are, and I'll bring them next time. And with that, let's go to our very first question. I'll ask each of the people asking the questions to say their name and where they're from, and then ask the question, and I'll try to direct them to one of the panelists, or if you have a panelist in mind, you can direct them.
Hello, my name is Nikita. I'm from San Jose, California, and my question is, when conducting research, you may have several questions that you would like to pursue. How do you choose which ones to address first and spend most of your efforts on?
Liz, why don't you take a crack at that?
That's a tough question. And in biological sciences, you're often limited by the technology that you can use. And so I always try to guide people, and myself, I've done this, to think of what new kind of technology coming on the scene will allow us to ask some question that hadn't been asked in that way in biology. So when DNA sequencing was first born, which was, decades ago, in its very early stages, it suddenly allowed us to say what's at the ends of chromosomes. So I think all questions in biology, at least, turn out to be interesting in one way or the other. And partly the choice, at least, is what is possible. And also, of course, what do you find interesting? So those are the two things, possible and interesting to you.
Anyone else?
Let me just jump in and say, I think oftentimes questions come to you that are of various sorts. Some of them are the kind of thing where you could be pretty sure if you did a particular experiment, you're going to advance knowledge by some certain degree because you have a pretty good sense of what's already known and there's just another step that you could take. And those are kind of interesting and worthwhile and productive. But then there's a big, hairy questions that maybe are going to be high risk and you might actually just fall on your face and never come up with an answer. But if you did, that would be groundbreaking. And I guess I would particularly say to people who are still in their earlier part of their scientific visioning, think about those big questions. If you're going to spend a career in science, why not work on something really profoundly important? You can do that incremental stuff along the way too. But don't miss the chance to do something that's really going to be groundbreaking.
And Joe, allow me to join in and echo Francis's statement. It won't surprise him at all that I agree with him wholeheartedly, and that his answer was what immediately came to mind to me, and that is to pursue a question when, if answered, would have a transformative impact. And that's what I would go for. You want to make a difference, a big difference.
Okay.
The only thing I would add to this
Dr. Selfie, go ahead.
Yes, is that we actually never work on a single question. There's all those other questions that are in the back of our minds that when something comes up, we hear of a new technique or something, it suddenly, we remember those questions. We're not thinking about them all the time. We may be working on one thing, but then something will appear and you'll realize that something you've been worrying about for quite a long time is now approachable. So there's also this idea of being flexible about what you're doing, to be able to sort of go with the flow, if you will, in terms of your experiment. As a new idea hits you, we often get a chance to give it a try, and that's really good.
And you never know.
I want to make. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Liz.
And you never know what's going to be important. When we sequenced the ends of an obscure pond scum organism chromosomes, nobody knew that that would have great interest in understanding cell biology and aging and disease of certain kinds in humans. So you don't know it, but also do the science as well as you can. I think that's something, because you never know what's going to be turning out in the long run to have an importance that you hadn't dreamed of. And enjoy doing it, if you can.
All right, and before we take the next question, I want to apologize to Marty Salpy. I call him a professor of chemistry, which I don't think is an insult, but he's actually a professor of biology. So we'll clear that up in case anybody wants to write to him and get him in the right department. Okay, let's have the next question then.
My name is Amy Chen, and I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. And my question is, what do you think will be the next big scientific or technological breakthrough? Or, given that making specific predictions might be difficult, what area or field do you think the breakthrough will occur in and why?
Wow, that's a good one. I think I'm going to stick Roderick with that one just because he's an observer of the world.
Well, that is a challenging question. I actually would begin by similarly echoing what Elizabeth concluded with in her last statement, which is one of the wonderful things about being a scientist and pursuing questions and investigations is you never really know exactly where you're going to end up. And one big discovery, one big realization will often lead you in directions that you hadn't anticipated. Answering one question opens up other questions, and there's just an endless universe of questions and big problems to pursue. So it's often hard to predict what will follow. I'll give you an example. One of the technologies that everybody is very familiar with and that I have some level of expertise in is magnetic resonance imaging. This initially was envisioned as something that would allow you to make anatomical pictures. But what we have learned from this is far more than pictures of anatomy. We even now began to get insights into things that you would think would be beyond human exploration, which are emotions and feelings and how those play out in each of us and similarly in all of us, of being able to decipher the connections in the brain and how similar they are from person to person. The connections that are involved in feelings that we have, such as joy or sorrow or anger. Those sorts of things are beginning to be studied and understood, and you just wouldn't have anticipated that from being able to make a clear image of the human body that you would get into those areas. So it's very difficult to predict. But to answer your question, I think one of the things I'm excited about and anticipate going in the future is this broad area of data science. This is emerging at a time where we have this hyperconnectivity around the world. We have huge sharing of information and data and insights. It's digitized. We have now these devices that allow each of us to communicate with each other and evaluate them. So one day we may have this sort of personal device that gives us continuous updates on how healthy we are from the cell and molecular level, that gives us feedback on the state of our health in such a way that we can actually take action to improve it. And I'm looking forward to the day when we actually have a 100-year lifespan expectancy. In fact, I depend on you, students in the audience, to deliver that. Bring us the 100-year life expectancy.
That's a good challenge. And also, please bring us an ability to cope with pandemics in the future so that we don't disrupt the world economy and everything in between. Anyone want to add to that, or shall we go on? I think we'll go on.
I'm going to just add very briefly, which is that I think that I was very much thinking that Roderick, and really understanding how our brain, our mind, how we as people work. And you can call it neuroscience, you bring in data science, but I think how we work, meaning not only understanding how our bodies work, but how our minds work, how we make decisions, this is going to be so important. So I think that will be, I hope, will be a big set of advances that we make.
Yeah. I have to jump in here and say that almost 30 years ago, I attended a conference called How the Brain Works. And I think that was probably premature, but I think every time we hold that conference, it's going to be a little bit premature because the brain is well, I don't want to mix metaphors here, but it's a tough nut. Let's take the next question.
Hello, I'm Max Dortwaller from Germany. As Professor Dr. Kaufman expressed himself, one driver of science is collaboration. It stands in conflict, though, with another driver, the Nobel Prize, which popularizes the notion of the lone genius. So how would you like to see those drivers balanced?
Marty.
I guess I have to answer that since I was named. So I'm going to argue that, in fact, the Nobel Prize, or any prize, is not the driver of what we do in our science. I know of very few people. I'm sure there are people that like recognition. We all like to be patted on the back for what we do. But I think that the actual saying, I'm going to do this experiment because it's going to get me some sort of prize or recognition, I think is not really the question. I often tell a story about when my daughter was 12 years old, and I was being inducted into the National Academy of Sciences, and she had to sit through the induction ceremony. And if you ever need help falling asleep, get a video of the induction ceremony into the National Academy of Sciences, because every one of the 70, now 100 people get up on the stage, shake hands with the president of the academy, have a picture taken, walk across the stage and sign a book. Visually very fascinating. And while they're doing that, someone reads one sentence about why they got elected. So by the time I made my way down to where my wife and daughter were, I realized my daughter must be just completely bored out of her mind. And I went there and I said, thanks for being here, but you know, you must have been very bored. And my daughter at 12 looked at me, as she has often looked at me, the kind of stupidest person on the planet, and said, Dad, don't you understand about those people? And I said, oh, what about those people? Because she had been listening to those sentences. She said, Dad, every one of the people on that stage were the first person in the world to see or do what they did. The first person. I'm exceptionally proud of that answer because that is, I think, one of the real drivers. To answer quickly about collaboration, we always collaborate. There have been wonderful efforts that have promoted collaboration. The discovery of the Huntington's disease gene, the discovery of the first mutated gene in ALS, and as Francis knows, the entire public effort to sequence the human genome, which was published daily so that everyone would be able to get the data as quickly as possible. All of these things are ways that people use collaborative means to promote the science. And I have to say, just for my lab, that the most progress is really made when everybody contributes to the discussion. There's not a hierarchy where I know what's going on. Actually, I'm usually the one that doesn't know what's going on. But when we all actually get together and talk about things, different ideas come up, and it's really exciting and stimulating.
That was great. I don't think we need to. Oh, Liz, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Joe, you may. Okay. I think science is such a mixture of creativity and then really rigorously following up things that I think you need both. The creativity often does come from people just thinking and making connections and ideas, lateral thinking and so forth, but then it has to be consolidated into real results that are verifiable and actually true and not just some sort of wild idea. And so you constantly have to bounce back and forth between the two. So never underestimate individual creativity and never underestimate collaboration.
All right. Maybe next question, please.
Hello, my name is Rishita and I'm from Punjab, India. And my question for the panel is, during your teen years, were you introverted or extroverted? And do you think such personality type influences the way your scientific growth or development and helps build leadership skills?
Francis, I'm having a hard time imagining you as introverted, but maybe you can clear that up for us.
Well, let me disabuse you of that misunderstanding. I went to college at 16 because my mother had taught me at home, so I was a little ahead of myself as far as the usual matching of ages and grades. And that meant I was a social outcast, especially in high school when everybody else was a bit more mature. So yes, I was introverted by necessity because being an extrovert when nobody really thought you belonged there wasn't going to get you very far. I kind of got over it a bit in the course of later stages, but I would say by nature, I'm not naturally inclined to be the person who walks into a party and goes up to people I don't know to say hello. It's a bit of a work to do that. Does that influence how I approach science? I think it probably doesn't hurt if you have a pretty vigorous inner life to fold that into scientific exploration of the unknown. And certainly for all of my years where I've had the chance to be engaged in science, which began, I guess, in about 10th grade in high school, that kind of opportunity to really enjoy the opportunity of being by yourself, digging deeply into understanding something, or engaged in an experiment that's going to be pretty all-compelling and require you to be up half the night finishing the experiment, as opposed to, being at the concert or the bar. But let me be clear. I don't think that there is a close mapping here of introversion and extroversion in terms of scientific aptitude or success. It's just who you are. And science can light a fire in all of those people, and it certainly lit that fire in the panel you have in front of you that day. Marty, go ahead.
So when I was, I think it was in high school, it may have been 8th grade, I'm not sure. I went to the public library and I got a book out on psychology. And I read about that there were two types of people in the world. There were introverts and there were extroverts. And I looked at the definitions, and not to put too fine a point on it, I was pretty nervous in front of girls, so I was definitely an introvert. I was comfortable talking, so I had to be an introvert. And I thought, oh, that's what I am. I'm an introvert. Fortunately, I had a very smart mother because I was talking to her about that, and she said, oh, that's interesting because I read in the paper that there's actually a third class. It's called an ambivert. Sometimes you're introverted, sometimes you're extroverted. You're not really in any of these classes. And I went, oh, well then that's definitely what I am. And from that point on, I never thought about it again. But it was a very important thing not to label myself or to say I am this thing or that. So but I completely agree with Francis. We bring in with what Liz said earlier. Everybody brings something to the science. Different perspectives, different backgrounds, different experiences, and it always helps. That's why we need to make science as diverse as possible to bring all the perspectives in and frankly all the aptitudes.
If I could just add in, briefly. When I first heard this question, it was a bit surprising because at our stages of life, speaking for the panel, you typically don't think about uh, whether or not you're an introvert or extrovert or how outgoing you are. Really is focused on problems. But when I think back to my days in high school, it really speaks to that developmental stage. And for this audience, where you tend to be self-critical, this is probably a very real and meaningful question and consideration and concern. But at the end of the day, we all are who we are. And just don't worry about who you are. Don't worry about what label you have. Just be who you are. Focus on scientific interests that you have and pursue those. And I think life will play out and you'll be happier for it. Just go for it. And live.
That's good advice, and I just want to add that I think the ambivert is perfect. Our son, for example, was very quiet and shy as a teenager in some way, but if you got him talking about computers, he would just talk all the time. So, it's totally context dependent on what you're excited about. I was very introverted unless I was talking about animals, and then I bored my friends to death as a teenager. But you also learn things. You learn you change. Now I'm much more extroverted, but I was the shyest person in the room when I was a teenager, unless I was talking about animals.
Well, I want to reassure Marty that there really are two kinds of people in the world. People who divide the world into two kinds of people and people who don't.
That's like the old line of there are three types of people in the world: those that can count and those that can't.
Okay. Dueling jokes. Let's have the next question then.
Hi, I'm Calvin Karthik from Canada. My question for the panel is, in your opinion, what is the hardest part of science research and what are some strategies to make it simpler?
Wow, I guess Calvin didn't make it to the meeting. What is the hardest part of science research and what are some strategies to make it simpler? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'll start, but others may want to dive in. I think from my experience, the hardest part of scientific research is that it fails a lot of the time. That if you're doing something that's actually important and not just sort of an obvious next step, there's a pretty good chance that whatever you set out to do isn't going to work. And especially early in your own independent career, when you have those failures, it's hard not to sort of take them personally. But the important thing there is to figure out what you learn from each of those failures. My research lab now at NIH, where we work on diabetes and we work on this rare form of premature aging called progeria, I would say the experiments in my lab probably fail about 70–80% of the time. And I think that's okay, because that says we're out there on the edge of what's possible, and oftentimes our hypothesis is wrong, or our protocol is wrong, or something went wrong. And again, you don't sort of get down in the dumps about that. You try to figure out, okay, what happened there? And maybe there's actually an insight from that that could lead me down a new pathway that I hadn't thought about. This question of how do you have a prepared mind for the unexpected applies to failures as well. So I found that to be particularly difficult early on. The hardest part of research is that you're going to fail a lot of the time, but that's okay. That means you're working on something important.
Anyone else? Yes, Marty.
So to reiterate this, again, the other thing about my daughter's line about being the first person in the world to understand something. If you're really looking into the unknown, you're going to fail. I'm going to say something that's probably not the greatest technique for this, but I actually find that it works of how to cope with this. And I take that as if you have a chance to look at a lab at a university, you will see that there may be individual graduate students, undergraduates, postdocs, that are going to be unhappy because their experiments are failing. But the head of the lab usually is a pretty cheerful person, and that's because at least one person's work is working out. Now, I want to take that idea and apply it to the individual. And that is, and no one likes to hear this, when things go wrong, do twice as much. Do other things. Have another set of experiments that you're doing because something works out. This is what the head of the lab is doing. There's a bunch of people working on different projects. One of them works out, he or she is happy. So one way of approaching this is to have more than one iron in the fire, to think about more than one thing, or to work on a project where you can go in two different directions. For years, my lab has worked on a set of nerve cells in the nematode Centroides elegans that are the cells that sense touch. And we have mutants that are defective in touch. And mutants, the animals can be defective in two ways. One is the cells aren't made. And those genes help us study the question of how does an organism make a particular type of cell, a developmental biology problem. But the cells are also cells that sense touch. And a lot of the genes that we've identified by mutation make the animals touch insensitive because they're not able to sense touch. And it allows us to look at the sensory mechanism of sensing a mechanical signal. Sometimes the developmental questions really pop and things go great in the lab. Other times it's the transduction, the sensory questions that work. So having more than one thing that you're looking at one time sometimes ameliorates the problem of having failure.
An additional comment about failure is certainly part and parcel of scientific investigation, and a significant part of learning, as Francis indicated, which is sometimes, I think, underappreciated, is how you can learn from something that didn't work. You know not to do it again or not in the same way. But as young scientists, those of you in the audience, it's important to be a part of the team and not be in this game of exploration by yourself. You really benefit from the ideas from others. When you run up against the wall, you should turn to someone else to help you gain additional insight. And that also will help you deal with the inevitable failures that will come along. So expect to fail, learn from it, and don't be shy about pivoting to someone else to get new views, additional insights, and potentially modify your direction or even help you better understand what didn't work and why it didn't work and what is more likely to work the next time.
So I would add one thing, and that is, don't feel you have to do this alone. Talk to people. Work. Goes back to the collaboration and sharing ideas. You don't have to show that you can do this on your own. In fact, that's probably detrimental.
Science is a team sport.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree more that you turning to get some sort of help from somebody just in terms of how you can cope with what may seem like a setback, and you can learn this sort of resilience just by turning to people, getting help. And one example of what looks like failure is you submitted a paper, your student, your postdoc has worked really hard, and it comes back with comments, and you just think, oh, these are such stupid comments. Why is this person not accepting what we want? And I found you have to sort of have a day or two to sort of say, okay, and then you come back and you say, what can I learn from this? Why did they not see what I think is so obvious or my student thinks is so obvious? And you learn, maybe I didn't communicate it right. That's a tough lesson to learn sometimes, and I think having the ability to turn to others and say, well, what did go wrong, helps you be resilient in the face of failures like this. Because a lot of science is the science community understanding and having communicated to them what you've discovered. And that is just as important a part of science almost as, I mean, it's not as important, but doing the work is one thing. If you didn't communicate it, the work wouldn't really exist. You have to communicate that work. And that can sometimes be a multi-step process.
Very nice. Let's hear the next question, please.
Hello, and thank you for having me. My name is Sky Lamb. I come from the Bronx High School of Science in the Bronx, New York. And my question is, what are ways that we can make science more accessible and relevant to the general public?
Francis, I know you've been wrestling with this. Maybe you have some thoughts?
That's a great question. I think we can look at where we are right now in the context of COVID and see that both there's been a great hunger for science information because people are afflicted in all sorts of ways by the virus and its economic consequences and its social consequences. And yet we are faced with a difficult situation where there's a lot of threads of information coming at people, and many of which, particularly coming from social media, are not really based on evidence, but oftentimes based on opinion, or worse yet, on conspiracies or intentional disinformation. So the burden is now heavy on scientists to figure out how to be particularly effective in communicating the information that is based on truth, that is based on the kind of public health messages that's going to help people stay safe and save lives. It hasn't gone all that well. I think we have to be honest about this. And scientists, perhaps used to being in a circumstance where their words would be taken at face value, are dismayed to see that is not always the case. And even scientists sometimes are being attacked for giving information that people just didn't want to hear. And that certainly happens a lot in the face of COVID. I think we as scientists need to take a hard look at the way in which we share information, that the way in which we speak to the public probably doesn't fit very well with the way we speak in the seminar room to each other, that we need to recognize that the things that move people to understand information are not necessarily tables of statistics or long discussions labeled with lots of jargon, but instead, human stories make a difference. And we as scientists sometimes rebel against that. Oh, well, that's an anecdote. Well, yeah, it is an anecdote. But if one can illustrate a point with a story, not an outlier story, but sort of a typical story, you have a much better chance of being heard. Communicators like Joe Palca know this really well, and I'm glad Joe is our moderator, and maybe he ought to say something to this question as well, even though he's supposed to be the moderator. But I think we have a lot to learn, and one of the things I'm engaged in right now as the President's acting science advisor is to do a bit of a postmortem, an audit of how government science communication has gone forward over the last couple of years, and see if there are better ways that we can do this. Because it's not just about COVID. We have other pandemics to think about. How are we going to handle that? We have climate change, which has not necessarily been formulated in a way that a lot of people fully understand it. And then going beyond that, many other science issues, just in terms of understanding basics of where is valid information coming from, what sources can you trust, and what sources should you be really careful about. We're not all that good at our discernment of the differences. So a lot to learn there. Let me just say, though, I think it's up to every scientist to take on board some of this responsibility. Because you are probably a voice that has credibility, even at this moment, with your neighbors, with people in Rotary Club meetings, with all kinds of other settings, and you shouldn't shy away from that. But learning how to get that across in a way that people really can understand what you're putting forward and can believe that you're giving them the kind of information they need That doesn't necessarily happen right away. I think we're working harder now in our training programs to give more and more students the opportunity to acquire some of those skills, and I think that's going to be critical in the future. The era where the scientists can basically walk in the lab, close the door, and say, it's somebody else's problem to explain what we're doing, that era is gone, and we really need to embrace collectively as scientists that this is something we can do and we must do. But Joe, I got to ask you, can you comment on this? Because you're the real expert in science communication in the group of the five of us right now.
Well, with the indulgence of the other panelists, I don't think the day where scientists feel like they can go into their labs and close the door is over. I think it should be, but I don't think the world has quite reached that point yet. I also think that it would be nice, I think you're right, Francis, that people like to hear stories, and a lot of times when I interview scientists, they say, oh, well, this is not about me, it's about my work. But when I'm talking to you, the scientist, it's about you. And so the more comfortable people can be about being human and being science, as if those were two distinct things, is good. And I like to show the human side of scientists because I think it makes them more relatable. And I think it's easier to hear information from people that you find relatable. I don't know why people attach their belief systems to somebody other than this, Liz Blackburn or Marty Calfee, but you guys have a lot of credibility, and you should be as approachable as possible. But those are some of my thoughts. I wish I had a magic wand. I've been trying very hard in my entire career to give accurate information, and I'm not sure I brought us into the promised land by doing that, but I'm glad at least now people are getting the idea that it's a team effort in communication as well as science. But anyone else want to? Marty, go ahead.
So one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is very important, is that not all high schools are the Bronx High School of Science. And there's a real need, I believe, for science education in the elementary and in the elementary and the high school level. And we don't need better training for teachers. What we need is more resources for the people that are there, the teachers that are there. Our teachers are woefully under-supported. And that is one of the most important things I think we could do to help the general understanding of science in the country, is to really shore up our education system.
Right.
And I have a suggestion for everybody in that huge auditorium, what each one of you could do, which is communicate something about why you love science, which I'm sure this is why you're there where you are, to somebody younger than you, maybe somebody in your school, somebody you can do it. Maybe even to the person at the corner store. Just tell them something that relates you to science, because as Joe and others have pointed out, we listen to people who are in our communities and who we relate to personally, and just tell people a little bit, and especially some younger people, why you love science, what has interested you this week even.
Again, I'm very much in sync with my co-panelists. Point that Marty just made, emphasized by Elizabeth, of reaching into your own experiences, your own environment, your own families, those around you, at the lower educational, mid, and upper educational levels where you talk about science to people that you're involved with, and where science is taught to everyone in schools, so that over the long range, everyone who goes through school learns about science appreciates it and the difference that this makes in all of our lives. If you think back to how we live life just a decade or two ago, it was very different, and that difference is largely due to advances in science that provide us with the quality of life that we have now in many instances. So I think it's all around us. The opportunity is there. The long range, I think, answer is for this to be more of a part of the educational experience that we all have as we go through our educational training.
All right, then let's hear from a virtual finalist.
Hi, my name is Talia Montenegro and I'm from Sydney, Australia. My question to the panel is, how do you think the definition of success in science has changed over time and why?
You accept the premise of the question. Has it changed? Marty Chalky says no.
I think something has changed, which is something we touched on earlier, collaboration. I think and it was alluded to that science was perhaps conceived of as something as, lone heroes sort of figures, the man in a white coat in his lab doing it all alone, something like that. And I think more and more, as was talked about, we realize that science is advancing by collaboration. Different parts of a collaboration can bring very deep, individual skills and expertise, but success now, I think, more and more is being recognized as somebody who can actually collaborate really well, and that'll have a big synergistic effect often on the kind of science that results, rather than them just going it alone and not having all of the technologies or approaches that you can bring to complex questions, which is what biology, at least, and human biology is all about, really complex questions. You need collaboration for many, many aspects of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Liz says it very well. Just thinking of specific examples, the Human Genome Project would be, I think, judged by most historians of science as having been a success. It was a remarkable opportunity to cross a bridge between ignorance of our own instruction book to having it in front of us. That was the work of 2,400 people in 6 countries. So it would hardly be said that each one of those people had a singular success all by themselves. It was a team effort that really had never happened at that scale before in biology, but such team efforts are happening now in other places, like neuroscience and the Brain Initiative, for instance. And I think basically that is the trend, the trend that we are seeing and should be celebrating in terms of what success looks like. But I'm not sure 50 years ago you could have quite contemplated that way of doing science. The technology and the opportunities to apply it at scale makes that possible. And being part of something like that, which maybe people worried about, well, I'll just get lost in the shuffle, nobody will notice I'm there. Not true at all. You talk to those people who are part of the Human Genome Project, pretty much every one of those 2,400 people would point to that as like a signal moment in their entire career to have been part of that team.
Okay. Marty, I'm going to move on because we have about 6 minutes left.
Oh, go ahead.
2 more questions. So you guys can do the math as well as I. Don't want to give completely short shrift to the final 2 questions. And we do have another question from a virtual finalist.
Hi, I'm Xinle Song from China. My question for the panel is, can happiness and joyfulness be quantified? And if so, do you think that the development of technologies in the past century contribute positively or negatively to the total happiness of mankind?
Happiness be quantified. I thought that would sort of be hard to imagine, but maybe somebody else has a clearer view of how that would happen.
Well, can I take on the second part? I think the second part of the question was, has technology made people happier? And I think because people can, many parts of the world, pandemic aside, but many parts of the world can look forward to a life in which they're actually healthier and freer of disease than they could before. And I think being really worried about, death from all sorts of diseases that we couldn't control before, is part of human happiness, is well-being. So I think that aspect is definitely contributed to human well-being compared with many, years ago. And quantifying happiness, there are all sorts of surveys and things that people can do, and they capture certain narrow aspects of happiness as defined, and you always have to look at the definition. But you can make attempts to do that, but you also have to recognize the whole person as a complex entity, and looking at a narrow thing like, you can quantify in questionnaires pessimism, for example. Now, that doesn't capture every aspect of pessimism, but you can do certain kinds of things. The trick is to always understand what is exactly being measured and what are its limitations, so that then the findings can be interpreted in a valid way and not overinterpreted.
I think we have time for just one last question. Go ahead.
My name is Hannah Spoon. I'm from Sullivan, Missouri, and my question is it possible to clone viable organs for the human body when transplants aren't possible?
Roderick, I have a feeling that's a question that you've thought about over the years. What do you think about that?
Well, I can see Francis smiling there because I'm interested to hear what he thinks also. But we are in this age of emerging regeneration of tissues and organs. And this is an area of active research with actually quite a bit of promise. For example, there is a clinical trial that's ongoing now in which scientists have demonstrated that they can harvest cells from individuals' kidneys who have renal failure. And after harvesting the set of cells from the kidney, identify progenitor cells for the different cell types that make up the kidney as a whole. Take those cells, expand them in the laboratory, place them in a structural matrix like a kidney, and essentially regenerate a functioning kidney, which is then reimplanted and will function and deliver renal function that individual is losing. So this has resulted in considerable hope that in the near to moderate future, we will be able to regenerate some organs and critical tissues that are parts of organs. This has been previously demonstrated for human bladder, for example. The kidney is much more complex than a bladder. So this advance is something we're looking forward to seeing completed with great hope and anticipation.
Francis, maybe you have the 30-second follow-up to that?
Roderick says it well. We've already now started programs where you take your own cells, dedifferentiate them to pluripotent stem cells, and then appropriately convert them into the cells you need. The area that's furthest along is eye disease, putting retinal pigment epithelial cells into the eyes of people who have gone blind from retinitis pigmentosa. But it's coming. Hearts, livers, kidneys, I think all imaginable. A lot of work to do in tissue engineering, but I think we will get there.
Excellent. Well, we've done it. We've spent another hour talking about science and answering your questions. And as I said at the start, these are all different and all interesting and all very valuable. First, I'd like to thank my panel. Maybe we can have a round of applause, a real round of applause, and I'll give a virtual one here. And second of all, just to wrap up, you've heard, I think, things that will inspire your science. It occurs to me now that I can put in a plug for my field. You may find after doing the science fair and going on in science that actually doing bench science is not what you had in mind, or it doesn't fit your personality as well as it might. That's what happened to me. I got my PhD in physiological psychology and decided I would be better off explaining science to people than doing it myself. So don't feel that that's a failure. At least I don't feel it's a failure, and it's an honorable career. But if you stay in science, well, you certainly have some role models to look up to. So with that, I'll hand it back to the moderator, Barb, and off we go. Have a good lunch.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to all of the Excellence in Science and Technology panelists. So, as you head out, you can pick up your lunch voucher at the entrance to halls B and C to your right. Please remember to attend our next panel featuring program alumni, the Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Impact panel at 2 p.m. We'll see you then.